everybody. It's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. here, and I cannot tell you how happy I am to be able to have this opportunity to talk to thousands of citizens in 15 countries on all the continents in the world who have come together today to protest this coup d'etat by big data, by big telecom, by big tech, by the big oil and chemical companies, by this global public health cartel led by Bill Gates and the WHO that now amounts to $2 trillion and wants to magnify and amplify its wealth and its power over our lives, over our liberties, that wants to subvert our democracies, that want to destroy our sovereignty and our control over our lives and our children's health. And I want to remind you, those of you who are not Americans, of something that every American child learns when we're growing up in this country about our history. During the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, who was one of the greatest presidents in American history, said to the American people, the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself. And we grow up hearing that, but people don't really understand what it means. But it was a very, very profound warning by Roosevelt, because he saw what the Great Depression was doing in Eastern Europe, in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, where that crisis was turning people towards fascism. In the Eastern countries, where the same crisis was turning citizens and governments towards communism, and also causing the collapse of governments all over the world. And in our country, in the United States, it's hard for people to remember today that almost a third of the people in our country were completely disillusioned with capitalism and wanted to turn to communism, and another third wanted to turn to fascism. And Franklin Roosevelt wanted to preserve our country for democracy, for free market capitalism, for civil rights, and to preserve our Constitution. And he recognized that the weapon of authoritarian control was going to be fear. And when I spoke a few weeks ago in Berlin, I reminded the people of Germany of a very famous story that happened during the Nuremberg trials after World War II, when Hitler's closest lieutenant, the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, was asked by one of the prosecutors, how did you get the German people? The German people are the most educated people in the world. They were some of the most tolerant people in the world. The Weimar Republic was one of the strongest democracies in the world. How did you take these people who were so well educated and so awakened and so tolerant and turn them into obedient slaves who committed some of the worst atrocities in human history? And Goering said, oh, that's a simple thing. And any of you can look up his quote, and I urge you to do so. And he said, and it works not just in a fascist government, but it works in a democracy, in a monarchy, in a communist government, in any government that you want. The job of the government is to put the people in fear. And if you can keep them in fear, you can get them to do anything that you want them to do, that they will turn into sheep. And there's a famous book by Naomi Klein that all of us should read called Disaster Capitalism. And that book shows, it's a historical chronology of all of the times during American history and the history of the world during the Great Depression, and during the financial collapse in 2008, during the financial collapse in Chile, for example, in 1973, during the time of the World Trade Center bombing, that authoritarian elements in a society and large corporations and wealthy plutocrats and oligarchs, wealthy families and individuals use crises to shift wealth upward, to obliterate the middle classes of those countries, and to clamp down totalitarian controls. And of course, it's an obvious thing that people who are used to voting for their governments are not going to vote for policies that make the rich people richer, that give corporations even more power over their lives, that reduce democracy and reduce civil rights. These are not good vessels for populism. In order to transform the government so that it will reward the rich with even more wealth, the people who want to do that in the large corporations, who want to orchestrate that kind of change, have to get rid of the civil rights. And the first civil right that they begin with is freedom of speech. They need to clamp down censorship, because censorship is the most important right. In our country, we put it number one, the First Amendment of the Constitution, because all the other rights depend on it. If a government can hide what it's doing, it can get away with anything it wants. If a corporation can lie to you and conceal information, if there's no transparency in a democracy, you do not have a democracy. So the coup d'etat that we are all fighting today is a coup d'etat that starts with a conspiracy between the government agencies and the big technology companies, the Silicon Valley billionaires, people like Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, and the people who run Google and Facebook and Pinterest and all of these other Silicon Valley corporations who are now in this conspiracy to make sure that we cannot talk about our grievances. We cannot say bad things about pharmaceutical products. We cannot question government policies that make no sense to us. And I'm going to say a few things about some of those government policies. Number one, I am not a conspiracy theorist. I follow the facts. I don't know that the COVID illness was laboratory generated in Wuhan. There is plenty of evidence that it was, but not enough evidence for me to say that it's a fact. My question is, why don't we know the answer to that? Why is Tony Fauci not being asked that question? Why is President Trump not launching an investigation? Or President Xi or the presidents of any of these countries saying, where did this come from? Because we need to know that. The global citizens, this is the worst calamity in history. And nobody seems curious about where this actually comes from. We know it didn't come from a bat in the wet market in Wuhan. And that story was a fable that it now has no basis, in fact. And we have Nobel laureates, and we have large institutions and investigative agencies and prosecutorial agencies are saying, we think it came from the Wuhan lab, and we think that it may have come from studies that were funded by Bill Gates and Tony Fauci. I don't know if this is true. But why are our government officials not asking that as the number one question? Why, instead of sending their police to suppress dissent, are they not sending the police to question people who may know the answer to that question? There are many other questions that I'd like to know the answer. Questions about masks. I'm very willing to accept if the masks work, and I want to wear them. If they're going to protect other people from transmissibility, then I want to wear them. But the studies that I've seen indicate that they do not work against viral transmission for the most part. There's some that say they may work under limited circumstances. What I don't want to be told is they work and you're going to wear them and you better not ask questions about it. Most Americans and most of the people on this planet, we want leadership. We don't want bullying. And we know the difference between bullying and leadership. We want to know the truth about hydroxychloroquine. We want to know why are we spending $18 billion on vaccines and only $1.4 billion on therapeutic drugs? What is the sense of that? There are many, many other questions that we in a democracy have a right to have answered without being called conspiracy theorists, without being vilified as being inconsiderate or being bad citizens. And you notice the people who are getting richest from this quarantine are the same people who are censoring criticism of the quarantine. Who is becoming the richest? Jeffrey Bezos. $83 billion he's made. And he owns Amazon, and he is censoring books that criticize the quarantine. Zuckerberg, who owns Facebook, who's made tens of billions of dollars by this quarantine. And he is censoring information that is critical of the quarantine. He censors my Instagram. He censors my Facebook. My Twitter page is also censored. And all of these people are the people who are making billions of dollars on the quarantine. And what I want to know is a simple question. Is the quarantine actually effective? We have 1.6 million people die every year from tuberculosis. We're not wearing masks. We're not on lockdown. What's the difference between tuberculosis and coronavirus? Tuberculosis has a vaccine, and the vaccine costs about $3. And that's why we're not on lockdown, because nobody is making $39 a vaccine or $300 a vaccine the way that Moderna and AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are making from this catastrophe. And that is the only reason that I can think of what the big tech villains and scoundrels and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeffrey Bezos and Bill Gates and Tony Fauci want you to do is they want us fighting with each other. They want blacks fighting against whites. They want Republicans fighting against Democrats. They want everybody polarized. They want everybody fragmented. Because they know that if we all get together, we're going to start asking questions. And those are questions that they can't answer. Why are you getting rich and why are we all getting poor? And what's the difference between tuberculosis and coronavirus? And why are we not wearing masks for the tuberculosis, but we are for the coronavirus? And where did it all come from? And all of those questions that we deserve an answer to, and we're not getting answered. We need to stick together. If you're a Republican or Democrat, stop talking about that. Stop identifying yourself. The enemy is big tech, big data, big oil, big pharma, the medical cartel, the government totalitarian elements that are trying to oppress us, that are trying to rob us of our liberties, of our democracy, of our freedom of thought, of our freedom of expression, of our freedom of assembly, and all of the freedoms that give dignity to humanity. And the last thing that all of us need to do is we need to stay educated and informed. And one of the things that I want to announce to you today is that Children's Health Defense, my organization, with the help of many of you who are in these crowds, is launching a journal, a daily journal, and we are going to weaponize information for you. We're going to tell you what the newest science is. We're going to take all the information that is censored everywhere else, and we're going to reprint it in our publication. And you can get that every day. So if you see something that is censored, we want to hear about it because we want to put it up. You are on the front lines of the most important battle in history. And it is the battle to save democracy and freedom and human liberty and human dignity from this totalitarian cartel that is trying to rob us simultaneously in every nation in the world of the rights that every human being is born with. So thank you for your courage, thank you for your commitment, and thank you for your brotherhood. And I can pledge to you that I will go down dying with my boots on, fighting side by side with all of you to make sure that we return these rights and preserve them for our children. And I will see all of you on the barricades. Thank you. I am Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., and let me explain to you a little bit about the journey that brought me here. I run the biggest water protection group in the world. It's called Waterkeeper Alliance. And back in the early 2000s, I was suing big coal-burning power plants in the United States for discharging mercury. At that time, and my only concern was the impact of the mercury on fish and on human health of the human beings who ate the fish. Around that time, it came to my attention that there was also large amounts of mercury in vaccines, much larger exposures to children than any child would ever get from eating fish. And so I began to address that, and we started an organization that was had a very limited scope, which was trying to remove the mercury from vaccines. Little by little, I came to understand that there were larger problems with vaccines. And the central problem, and the one we were most deeply concerned with, was that vaccines in the United States were not safety tested. They have an exemption that is not available to any other medical product. And that exemption, which most people cannot even believe, is an artifact of CDC's legacy as the Public Health Service, which was a quasi-military agency. And at the time that the vaccine program was launched, the purpose was a national defense purpose. And they wanted to make sure that vaccines could be quickly formulated and deployed in order to derail attacks by foreign countries with biological substances. So they removed the regulatory impediments, including the necessity to test vaccines, to safety test vaccines against placebos. And so my very narrow purpose in starting the Children's Health Defense was to address this problem and get vaccines properly safety tested. Because if they're not safety tested, nobody can tell you with any medical authority whether that vaccine is injuring more people than it's saving. And yet, as we continued on with this advocacy, it became very clear that there were other problems as well. There was problems with the corruption in our political system. The pharmaceutical companies had not only corrupted our politicians with huge amounts of lobbying money, they had captured the agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from public health threats, the CDC, the FDA, the HHS. They had captured the press in our country by huge influxes of advertising dollars, which had neutralized the press. And they had effectively subverted American democracy by neutralizing all of those institutions that the founding fathers of our nation had created to stand between a greedy corporation and a vulnerable child. The Congress had been corrupted. The regulatory agencies were captured. They had become sock puppets for the industry they're supposed to regulate. The press had been sidelined, and worst of all, they had passed a law in our country in 1986 that gave pharmaceutical companies complete immunity from liability. So there was no incentive for any of those companies to make vaccines safe. And little by little, we recognized that this was not just an American issue. This was a global issue. I came 2 years ago when I was arguing the Monsanto case, and I met my partner here, Senta Dupuy. And Senta already understood the connection that had taken me so long to formulate between toxics in our environment, the capture of our agencies and our political structures by those powerful companies. she also recognized that pharmaceutical companies were the most powerful, more powerful than oil, more powerful than the chemical industry, and a greater threat not only to our children's health, to all the institutions of democracy, not in the United States, but all around the globe. So we need people of goodwill, people who have courage, people who have a nonconformist way of thinking, who understand that we are being lied to, that the entire political structure today is saturated in pharmaceutical propaganda. And we have watched over the past few years something that is extraordinary. We are at an inflection point, I believe, in human history, the largest and most critical inflection point that humanity has ever encountered. During the same Great Depression that spawned Adolf Hitler, we were very lucky in our country that we had a leader, Franklin Roosevelt, and he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He understood that fear would drive us into totalitarianism. But now they have a source of fear that is the most pervasive and all-encompassing power that they've ever had, which is the fear of pandemics. Governments love pandemics the same way that they love wars, because it gives them power, it gives them control, and it gives them the capacity to impose obedience on human beings. And today we have an inflection of new technologies that give governments the capacity to impose controls on populations that have never been imagined before in human history by any tyrant in history. We have 5G, which has created a surveillance state. And then they have another innovation, which is digital currency. And once they have digitalized our currency and gotten rid of the cash economy, they have absolute control over us, because they'll be able to tax every transaction. The banks will be able to cash in on every transfer of wealth, every transaction, no matter how minuscule, no matter how small. But also they'll be able to enforce obedience, because if you're disobedient, they'll be able to shut down your bank account and starve you, and you'll have no access to cash. And many people argue that this pandemic was a plandemic, that it was planned from the outset, that it's part of a sinister scheme. I can't tell you the answer to that. I don't have enough evidence. A lot of it feels very planned to me, but I don't know. I will tell you this. If you create these mechanisms for control, they become weapons of obedience for authoritarian regimes, no matter how beneficial or innocent the people who created them. Once you create them, they will be abused. 100% guarantee that they will be abused. And all of the people who are out on the street now, who are arguing with this new imposition that we're seeing all around us, of authoritarian control, of people being told, wear your mask. And you know, I think everybody in Europe, everybody in Germany, everybody in the United States, if they were told, here's why you should wear a mask, here's the science that says it will help, here is the science that says it works, that you will stop transmission to other people, everybody would wear it with no problem. What we know is that we're not being dealt with honestly. We're being told, this is the science, but it's not. It's an appeal to authority. It's science because Tony Fauci and Bill Gates tell us it's science. We want to see the studies. We want to see the studies on hydroxychloroquine. We want to see the studies on whether the lockdown is killing more people than the coronavirus. We want to see real science and real risk assessments. And we are not going to take the word. My father told me when I was a child, people in authority lie. And we all, if we are going to continue to live in a democracy, we need to understand that people in authority lie. People in authority will abuse every power that we relinquish to them. And right now, we are giving them the power to micromanage every bit of our lives 24 hours a day. They're going to know where we are. They're going to know the money that we spend. They're going to have access to our children. They're going to have the right to compel unwanted medical interventions on us. The Nazis did that in the camps in World War II. They tested vaccines on gypsies and Jews. And the world was so horrified after the war, we signed the Nuremberg Charter. And we all pledged when we do that, we would never again impose unwanted medical interventions on human beings without informed consent. And yet in 2 years, all of that conviction has suddenly disappeared. And people are walking around in mass where the science has not been explained to them. They are doing what they're told. They are these government agencies are orchestrating obedience. And it is not democratic. It's not the product of democracy. It's the product of a pharmaceutical-driven biosecurity agenda that will enslave the entire human race and plunge us into a dystopian nightmare where the apocalyptical forces of ignorance and greed will be running our lives and ruining our children and destroying all the dreams and dignity that we hope to give to our children. And the launch of this organization, Children's Health Defense in Europe, is a beachhead. It's an announcement to the world that we are not going to take it. We are building institutions to fight your institutions. And you have global institutions, and we now have a global institution. And I'm very proud of the people that I'm sitting at this table with, who are people who have the courage to challenge, to speak truth to power, and to think independently, and to break away from the orthodoxies that are enslaving so much of the human race. Thank you.
Nightmare and insanity are akin. Mysterious and involuntary states that skew and distort objective reality. One wakens from nightmare. From insanity, there is no awakening. Whether Americans live in the one state or the other is the paramount question of this era. For 200 years, Americans have been indoctrinated with a mythology created, imposed, and sustained by a manipulating cabal, a financial elite that built its absolute control on the muscle and blood, ignorance and credulity of its citizenry. It has now metastasized into the corporate tyranny that owns and controls America. America began with the invasion of a populated continent and the genocide of its people. Once entrenched, it embraced enslavement of another race. With those pillars of state in place, it declared itself an independent nation in a testament that proclaimed the equality of all mankind. In that monumental act of hypocrisy, America's myth had its genesis. A constitution was written that came to be regarded as Holy Writ. Designed by men of wealth and prominence, its central purposes were to defend private property and suppress mass democracy. It has fulfilled those mandates beyond the dreams of its creators. With the existing oligarchy secure in law and native people largely exterminated, the ruling class increased its wealth and power fantastically in the 19th century, using the government as its enabler, exploiting to the limit the device of chartered corporations. So empowered, the financial elite used the military to expand its sway beyond the continent. Regions, territories, islands, and whole countries were annexed, invaded, and possessed outright, their peoples crushed, suppressed, and exploited. Because ordinary Americans, like any people, need to believe that whatever the ruling class undertakes in their name must be essentially benevolent, noble in purpose, and justified in fact, the American myth had to be radically modified for imperial expansion. The foundational myth was that the Americans had come to a howling wilderness teeming with godless savages, and through invincible strength of character and purity of purpose had tamed the land and honorably earned the right to possess their bountiful home. In the era of extraterritorial expansion, that version was polished to justify and ennoble imperialism. The new corollary was that America was obliged by our manifest destiny to carry our mission into barbaric darkness wherever tyranny created abuse and suffering. A national myth that absolutely binds the loyalty of a people to its government must be a subtle and powerful elixir that elevates and aggrandizes that people's self-regard. National policy will then appear to be an extension of its superior citizenry's inchoate will and an instrument of justified arrogance toward the lesser world. The simple, powerful myth of America's heroic and altruistic benevolence, shaped by the financial elite, infused Americans with a hubristic belief in their racial superiority that mobilized gave imperialist enterprises the character of a quasi-religious crusade. In this way, insatiable imperialism acquired the apparent moral perfection of a syllogism. With World War II, the world was reconfigured. American capitalism emerged supreme from the horror that had virtually wrecked its capitalist partners. The Soviet Union, though, in spite of having absorbed much the greatest devastation of all from Nazi Germany, rose astonishingly from its ruin to become the sole rival to America as a world power. This challenge was not competitive, it was systemic. Soviet communism was a direct threat to American hegemony in that it categorically refuted the philosophical basis of predatory capitalism. Grounded in Marx and Lenin, it attacked capitalism's inherent evils, monstrous inequities, and flagrant injustices that, when exacerbated by speculation, exploitation, and fraud, would eventually destroy it. And it promoted world revolution to that end. The Cold War required further refinement of the American myth. Instead of simply intervening where circumstances supposedly demanded that we impose our system, America now had to be the shield and bulwark of the sacred capitalist system in which free enterprise, magically identified with democracy, was equally to be defended. This version held through many surrogate confrontations in the era of mutually assured destruction, and survived even the debacle of Vietnam, lasting until the collapse of the Soviet Union. On radio and television, Americans were subjected to an unrelenting barrage of hyper-patriotism, in which American moral superiority was a given, and America's self-touted courage, generosity, and decency were its unchallengeable proofs. The implosion of the Soviet Union left America, in its own terms, the sole superpower in a unipolar world, which required further retooling of the myth. The practical effect of having no doomsday enemy, China wouldn't do yet, was to supercharge its element of pure hubristic ego. America was no longer just the defender of the free world from heresy. It was now, by virtue of its glorious self-touted exceptionalism, required to oversee and police it in the interests and for the benefit of all. Power tends to corrupt, said Lord Acton, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When the only rival to American power disintegrated, our ruling elite saw the opportunity, for the first time in history, for one country to absolutely dominate and control the world. This consensus was expressed in a policy statement by major hard right-wing political players titled The Project for a New American Century. This triumphalist manifesto laid out a plan for absolute American access to and control of essential resources and raw materials worldwide, guaranteed by our military enforcing full-spectrum dominance. The American myth, which had lost some momentum in the totally unexpected so-called Cold War victory, was now re-energized with a proactive essence and endowed with the glowing radiance of a true and, for the first time, self-professed imperial mission. The attack on the towers, an unimaginable provocation, was the trigger mechanism for the explosive launch of the effort to impose that imperial model in practice on the world. It has been without question the most spectacular failure in the history of American misadventure. After a decade marked by the waste of trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives, the stunning bankruptcy of our internally burglarized nation, and a consequent recession more fundamentally damaging than the Great One, Imperial America has nothing to show for the astonishing folly of its arrogant overreach, but unequivocal disasters in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, with no end of madness in sight. It is clear that the hypnotic hold of the American myth on the loyalty of the people has led only to disgrace and tragedy, and set a course to inevitable imperial decline and ruin. This truth, though, entirely mistakes the purpose of the myth. It was never intended to serve either our country or our people. It was created solely to shield, buttress, and exalt the financial ruling class. It has done that with complete and astonishing success. As a prime example, the massive looting of funding for the Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan wars to enrich the corporate tyranny is on a unique scale of its own, without anything remotely comparable to its flagrant obscenity in the whole long history of war. Neither the Pentagon nor the government can account for the billions of dollars that have vanished there. There is no doubt that beyond the outrageously inflated no-bid contracts given to giant corporations with their obscene guaranteed profits, much of the money was simply stolen by, through, or in spite of the military, and distributed among thieves and accomplices. Much of it came in bricks on huge pallets, for convenience, presumably. As this wholesale corporate robbery was in progress under military oversight abroad, the corporate tyranny evolved a new set of impenetrably complex devices for the generation of money without either any economically productive source or result at home. The sole driving force and purpose of capitalism is, of course, the realization of profit. According to that iron calculus, reducing production costs increases profit margin. This leads to the obvious conclusion that as production costs near zero, profit is maximized. There is no provision for social good in capitalist theory. Corporations, created to optimize commercial opportunity through efficient specialization, were originally required to operate for public good, but that provision was quickly finessed and forgotten. American law courts have always favored corporate concentrations of wealth since they, like the Congress, exist to serve moneyed interests. And the judiciary has consistently cooperated in ruling reliably for corporations and against the interests of the people. Indeed, without considering the question in law, the Supreme Court long ago endowed corporations with personhood, that is, with all the rights of human beings under our Constitution. That this travesty occurred as a slipshod clerical error shows that the court preferred to mask this perversion of the intent of the 14th Amendment as an unexamined assumption, rather than risk an eventual test which would have created public outrage. Given the collusion of Congress and the courts in securing legal invulnerability for the corporate tyranny, and the fact that corporations' only duty is maximization of profit, it was inevitable that megabanks, huge brokerage houses, giant insurance conglomerates, gilded hedge funds, and credit agencies pretending to certify their work all engaged in massive criminal fraud and deception for just that purpose. The result was the crash of '08, the recession, and the unprecedented bailout of the biggest banks and investment houses with taxpayer dollars. So much for the invisible hand of the free market. In recent years, two related trends have battered the American myth. First, any belief the world had in it has been shattered by a catastrophic series of imbecile military disasters which has eroded its efficacy at home. Second, in response, the state has made crude efforts to boost its waning power by imposing totalitarian-style surveillance, intimidation, and coercion on the American people to a degree unprecedented in scope and scale. The vast, clanking medieval apparatus of Homeland Security that has sprouted like an enormous poison fungus since 9/11, with its brutal police state mindset, the odious Patriot Act with its flagrant subversions of the Bill of Rights, the endless fantasy-based terror peddling of the prostitute corporate media with its clowns and harpies churning irrational fear and anger in the uninformed, all this grim repressive machinery is a ham-handed attempt to distract Americans from the real causes of their injury, abuse, and oppression. And yet, even with the American myth now exposed for the tissue of lies, deceptions, and frauds that it has always been, it still keeps its phenomenal hold on the great mass of American people. The sad reality is that for the majority, their own identities have been so deeply and thoroughly infused with the myth that to disbelieve it is to disbelieve in themselves. So the dead American myth lives on in its deadness, horribly masking our crapshot economy, our bankrupt debtor's prison of a society, our ghost dance charade of kabuki democracy, while typhoons of impending social, economical, and ecological disaster build their enormous, lightning-charged thunderheads above the dark future before us. And what does the dead myth still obscure? What is beyond the wall of failing deception and dishonesty? What horrors has the shoddy fable so long and effectively concealed? It is a world brutalized by the violence of our imperialist mania. It is the wrecked and pillaged economies looted by our predatory capitalist austerity regimes. It is the hundreds of millions of starved, dying children sacrificed to Wall Street commodities gaming. It is the multitudes of innocent, ignorant people barely surviving under absolutist regimes propped up by our tax dollars, while our banks siphon off profits from arming their brutal police states and bribing their kings, sheikhs, or generals. It is the millions of dead and maimed and raped populations of simple tribal people that our indiscriminately murderous juggernaut has left in its bloody wake in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. It is the bitter and appalling legacy of hate and repulsion, disdain and fear which America has earned with its hegemonist villainy in every region of the world. And at home, what is it we Americans have been so complicit in hiding from ourselves, in our devotion to the perverse legend that has come to inhabit our souls like an incubus? It is millions of us with no work or hope in middle age whose jobs and homes have been devoured by the sick fraud machine of Wall Street. It is the trash, demolished weed lots of our major cities crumbling in fire-gutted ruin. It is the many cities with industries defunct and factories dismantled and shipped overseas. It is our decaying, defunded public schools, our bankrupt states and counties, our overtaxed, antiquated public transportation systems, our obsolete, dissolving infrastructure, our gigantic and irrational prisons horror, our cynical healthcare con game, and over it all, the jackboot mechanism of our police state, armed and empowered, ready for use against us all. This is where we are. The great question now is whether we can awaken from our long nightmare and face the terrifying and exhilarating prospect of living in reality without the false props and dishonest constructs of a hoodwinked and dishonored people, or whether we have internalized the falsity to such an extent that it has become a collective insanity. In 1846, Henry David Thoreau, offended to his soul by the American invasion of Mexico, protested and went to jail. In his essay on civil disobedience, he said this of state policy: "If injustice is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine." To attempt to break the death grip of the American myth will be a titanic challenge. To even begin to rebel against the might of the national security state will require the courage to face far more than official disapproval. Imperial America will respond to even the most peaceful and orderly protest with hard police action, and the level of repression will rise with the scope and seriousness of the action undertaken. Small protests will have no effect. Organized mass demonstrations will draw the brutally motivated national security state apparatus down upon them. Americans, excepting our underclass, have no experience with violent police or military repression. Those who commit peaceful civil disobedience will swiftly find to their cost how it works. In a national security state that has eradicated all laws that prevent abuse of the public, whatever the state does is legal. To such a pass have we in America come, as a result of our long historic indoctrination and abject submission to our ruling class. To achieve any redemption for Americans, to make possible any more just, humane, and life-honoring society, will require complete abandonment of the system of predatory capitalism. It offers no prospect of reform or improvement, and we have all been witness to the absurdly corrupt idiocy of our so-called democratic process for generations. America is nearing the greatest crisis point in its history, and the terrific coming cataclysm will determine the future of our country. If we cannot rise in dominating numbers to reject the heartless, mindless, soulless machine of imperial predatory capitalism, we will be condemned to a fascistic command and control horror in which human beings are mere possessions of the state, units of production or service, and then perhaps not even that, as excess population in that brave new world may simply be eliminated. That end is not inevitable. We are not lost. We are not defeated, since to this moment we have not engaged. We have not honored our responsibility as human beings. We have not defended our humanity. We have abjured our power and let ourselves be ruled. All around the world, the rolling thunder of irresistible outrage is now heard and felt. In Egypt and Spain, Syria and Greece, Iraq and Sudan, Afghanistan and Ireland, everywhere the legitimate anger of humanity is fueling an uprising against the dead hand of predatory capitalism and its evils. And in Americans, so long trapped, encapsulated like flies in amber in a false religion of state idolatry, the anger is deep, widespread, and growing. The myth is broken and dead. It is up to those who know and care to lead. Thomas Paine said, "These are the times that try men's souls." Nothing is guaranteed us. That can't matter. We cannot consider odds or outcomes. We simply cannot let the machine of injustice grind on. We must confront with calm courage a vicious tyrannical system that is destroying the earth and its life and its people. We must put our lives on the line to oppose it, and we must do it now. The nightmare machine of rapacious exploitation has overthrown decency and reason, and its bloody human treason flourishes over us. This must be ended. We must end it. Let your life be a friction to stop the machine.
Doesn't make any sense. How do you sleep at night? There is no honor in this. There is no honor in this. There is no honor in this, man. There's no honor in this shit. There is no honor in this shit.
In every corner of the world, we are being pressured by a monoculture, a global consumer monoculture. It is being pushed by our governments who have a blind idea of growth and development. That means supporting and subsidizing giant multinational corporations and banks, particularly through trade treaties, by deregulating global trade and finance. We're removing rules for Monsanto, for Walmart, for Coca-Cola, so that they can move more freely, and allowing foreign investment to come into every country. Now, all of that constitutes a breakdown of community. Unemployment, financial insecurity, impoverished governments are a consequence of this. And all the while, this global corporate economy uses more and more energy, more and more resources.
The promise of development and progress is starting to crack. The issues facing us are connected to a common global economic system. All of our people are being squeezed every day by that. And all of our imaginations are being colonized by that system.
It's a story of either continuing poverty and deprivation or new forms of poverty and deprivation. So both ecologically and socially, economically, we are actually on a very steep process of decline and sustainability and conflicts which are arising out of that.
More and more, everything is being put into the hands of big corporations. In particular crops, entire markets have been taken over by corporations like Monsanto.
We are importing and exporting the same products in the global economy, creating a distance between production and consumption so that the food that people eat on a daily basis is coming from further and further away.
There is alternative. The alternative lies in reverse this process and to regain control over the territorial and the very material basis of our existence.
The resistance now to globalization will not come from the government of India or from the government of Brazil or the government of Mexico, which is in cahoots with the United States government on several issues. It will only come from local communities everywhere.
People are not taking things lying down. Either they're resisting these forms of destructive development and or they are creating their own alternative ways of human well-being.
There's a very urgent need for a new kind of dialogue between people living in the global north and the global south.
We want to shift this global business to local business, which means give strength to the people and to real economy and not to the financial and fantasy economy.
The bottom level, what we need to do to create change is to reconnect with the people around us, with the land around us.
It's about rebuilding our deeper connections to nature and to ourselves. And this is a structural way of doing it, localizing economic activity.
And you'll still have a relationship maybe with people in the United States and so on, but those will be cultural relationships. Maybe even some economic relationships, but they're not relationships of dependence.
The localization movement is growing. At the heart of this movement is a very broad and very powerful local food movement that is gaining momentum around the world. That is accompanied by local business alliances, local energy, decentralized renewable energy systems, local finance. You have the revival of local knowledge systems, and very importantly, local spiritual traditions that recognize and reinforce the oneness of life.
What we need is not scaling up of those solutions, but scaling out of those solutions, replication in millions of these variety of solutions, innovative solutions that are emerging. It's quite possible.
What we need to do is to actually create platforms in which these sorts of initiatives are able to get together, are able to synergize, are able to actually build those larger narratives, are able to begin to change the public discourse.
We're trying to create an alliance, an international alliance for localization, because we need a united no, one giant no to a continuation of that system. And at the same time, we need to see ourselves as actually part of an enormous movement involving hundreds of millions of people that are saying many yeses to diverse ecosystems, diverse cultures, diverse identities. This is about reclaiming our right to be who we are in our different ways of being. It's about reclaiming the diversity that is life.